First of all, it's just amazing to see so many people. It's just really refreshing. And you're going to be enjoying several different speakers. I'm going to pass over in a minute because I don't know very much about this at all, he said. I'm going to be passing you over to Linda Ward, who's going to be talking about Mr. Watkins' famous path. We'll be going on to Fran and some bathing bells and a bit of sewage news. Can't miss out on that. Miller Andy will be giving some expert guidance on the milling bits. Marsha Omani will be giving us some watery revelations. And Ian Broom will be giving us the end of the line, kind of literally. Ho ho, yeah, I know. I worked that one out before. And then we'll be going over, interestingly, we'll be going over to Ruth Westerby, who, big thanks to Ruth for actually hosting this on her Zoom. And we'll be going over to Ruth for the hot news on what's actually happened to this incredibly important stretch of land. And don't doubt, this really is an incredibly important stretch of land. I mean, it's only 113 acres, mostly very soggy at the moment. If I nipped out of my office here into my bedroom, I could throw a brick into large pools of water because it's just flooded recently. Why are these meadows so important? Oh, can I just let in somebody? Honestly, what a time to be saying, can I come to the meeting? Yep, there we go. Why are these meadows so important? Well, it is only 113 acres, but they are stacked with history. I mean, don't doubt it. We've got Civil War connections here. I was talking to a bloke the other day who was finding musket balls from the Civil War. We've got an ancient monument here. We've got the moot point, the meeting point, the sort of from dating back to possibly Norman times at one part of the meadows. We've got so much history, we don't actually know what's there. It's been in the hands of a dairy farming family, the Matthews, for almost exactly 100 years. They've had 3 generations of the farm looking after it. I wouldn't say that they've necessarily been that kind to the land over that time, but possibly a lot kinder than has happened in the last 12 months as the tenancy has passed. And we've seen the land ploughed up. We've seen historic meadows ploughed up. And my goodness, we really don't know what history is being ploughed up when that happens. Now, I'm going to say, and you'll hear this a lot this evening, next slide, please, Chloe. And it's a great opportunity to just say thank you, Chloe Bradman, who with Ruth is part of Friends of Bartonsham Meadows. And she's in charge of doing the images. And here we go. So next slide, please, Chloe. This is just to show you, this is actually from a couple of weeks ago. One of the people in the parish, this is Joe's photo of the famous Victoria Bridge, which at that point was unpassable. Next slide, please, Chloe. Going back, not that, I mentioned the Matthews, the dairy farmers taking over the land, and it's about this time. It was the same time that Mr. Bentfield Hucks arrived with his Blériot, I think it's a Blériot aeroplane, and onto Bartonsham Meadows and gave trips, paid for trips. This was 1913. Poor old boy didn't realise that in a year's time he'd be embroiled in the First World War. And as an aeronaut, of course, he duly took up flying, and he did sadly die in action. Bizarrely, he became a test pilot, but he caught flu towards the end of the war and died of that. But it's a reminder that these meadows are historic in all sorts of strange ways. And I get you to just have a look at how big those trees are in the distance. So I'm now going to pass you on to Linda. Where are you, Linda? And she'll carry you forward.
Right. Good evening, everybody. We start our walk on Castle Green. Following the Civil War, the castle was demolished and the newly acquired Castle Green and Park was taken over by the city authorities who assumed responsibility for the development of the Green. By the mid-18th century, Lord James Beauclerk, Nell Gwyn's grandson, provided the patronage for the establishment of the walkways, landscaping, and a new pavilion. And in 1752, the Society of Templars were formed to take over the city from the city authorities and run the Green as an open public space. After the Battle of Trafalgar, to honour the war hero, they had erected Nelson's column, which was paid by public subscription. Unfortunately, they didn't have enough funds to put Nelson on top of it. John Price, in his book of 1796, The Historic Account of Hereford, wrote about the many walks around Hereford, including Bartonsham Meadows, walking from the Green, around the fields, to the vineyard, Hafford Shut, and the Portfields, highly recommending the fine views across the valley. Next slide, please, Chloe. However, to get to the meadows meant having to walk through the grounds of the newly built infirmary, causing much controversy with the hospital board and governors, worried for the health of their patients. With the constant use of the path running through the gardens to the Bartonsham Meadows, disturbing them all. Though some considered it detrimental to the patients, others thought a good walk was important. The arguments continued for a number of years, but the hospital governors were reluctant to give up land for a public footpath. In 1865, a piece of land, which included the site of the old castle mill, was obtained by the Board of Governors, who promptly enclosed the gardens with boundary wall and railings. A new entrance to the infirmary was created with the Porter's Lodge built on the site of the old mill. It's still here today, thus making the footpath less accessible to the public. The City Council were keen to construct a riverside path in front of the infirmary to link up Castle Green and Bartonsham Meadows, and approached the hospital governors again in 1893. They reluctantly agreed to the construction of a new footpath. However, there were strict conditions, including preventing people bathing in front of the infirmary. In addition, a fence built to stop rubbish being thrown into the hospital grounds. And the path was to be diverted from the hospital and run along the demolished mill land alongside the river, and it was to be locked at night. At last, the public gained a useful asset, only briefly, as the following year, the path was washed away and by the winter floods. Next slide, please, Chloe. This is where Alfred Watkins comes into the story. You associate Alfred Watkins with the discovery of ley lines and his book, The Old Straight Track. Incidentally, it's its centenary this year. But he was also so much more. When he died in 1935, his obituary said he was a scholar, miller, brewer, archaeologist, naturalist, inventor, magistrate, county councillor, politician, and a leader of public opinion. He advocated free trade schemes and endorsed votes for women and the suffrage movement in Hereford. Next slide, please, Chloe. One of his early successes is the construction or the reconstruction of the path using more robust materials of stone, iron rods, and concrete. It provided the locals with a pleasant walk running from Castle Green around the meadows to the Whalebone Inn and Iron Wharf. Next slide, please, Chloe.
Yeah.
And this, together with the ornamental gardens adjoining Victoria Bridge, which was built in 1898, is the path that we see today. The bridge was displaced the ferry, which once operated across the river here. This moved downstream to Hungerton Village. Next slide, please, Chloe. This is a photograph taken in 1910. It shows the terrace and the ornamental flower beds, which were stocked and maintained by gardeners employed by the City Council, using flowers and bedding plants grown in their own nurseries, which were on the site of the current Rose Garden estate. Following the outsourcing of the services in latter years, it has been left to local volunteers who do a wonderful job maintaining the flower beds. However, the footpath is a different matter. It is somewhat neglected. The path is cracking up, overshadowed with trees, and often covered in silt from constant winter flooding. It is a shadow of the former elegant path created by Alfred Watkins. I now hand you over to Fran.
Thank you, Linda. Next slide, please, Chloe. So we move on our virtual tour, and you can see in the top, you can see the loop of the River Wye, known as the Bartonsham Loop, in this old map of the 1930s. We enter the river, the side of the river, following on from Linda's talk, up on the left-hand side where you see the river loop joins us there. And we're moving on now to think about swimming and sewage. I mean, these might appear to be uncomfortable bedfellows, but I can assure you that in the history of the British love affair with swimming, they've spent a lot of time together. If we look down the loop on the left-hand side of the picture, you can see below the farmhouse, this is within the Bartonsham Meadows, you're looking down at the Bartonsham Meadows now, lower than the farmhouse, you can see some writing, and that's whereabouts the swimming annex used to be, called the Bartonsham or the Bassam. And more or less opposite that, where you can see some outlines on the map, that's where the original iron sewage treatment works were erected in 1885. Next slide, please, Chloe. So we have a long history of enjoyment of outdoor bathing in this country, about 2,000 years. And there was only a small break in that for a few hundred years, whilst it became impossible really for people to learn to swim or teach their children to swim, because the way of finding out whether somebody was a witch at that time was whether they floated in water. So it really didn't incentivize you to swim or to float or to teach your children to swim. And that carried on up till Stuart times. But then with increasing industrialization and an emphasis on health and fitness, and Thomas Cook starting his excursions to the seaside in Victorian times, there was a renewed interest in outdoor bathing, particularly from 1875, when Captain Matthew Webb swam the Channel for the first time. And it became the thing to do to swim in the sea or to swim in a local river or lake. And of course, Hereford wasn't immune to this new trend, and they decided that they would also want to swim. And of course, where else would you swim in Hereford but in the lovely River Wye? And where else in the River Wye than at the Bartonsham or at the Bassam. Next slide, please, Chloe. And so you can see here the outdoor changing annex on the edge of the Bartonsham Meadows. And you can see the steps that go down from that changing annex into the water. And if you look carefully, what looks like a sort of crocodile in the water is actually the plank or the diving board that goes out into the river. And here are people enjoying the sunshine. So Herefordshire Town Council built this annex early in the 20th century, and it was very popular. People went to swim in this area and carried on enjoying swimming. And in fact, in the archives of the Hereford Times back in May 1915, which of course was in the middle of the First World War, there was a report in the Hereford Times that the river was in a splendid condition. It was fresh and of comfortable temperature, and it was the advent of summer weather to see bathing commencing in the Wye at the Bartonsham bathing station. This bathing station that was built by the council was also staffed with a lifeguard and with a boatman all the way through from May until September. And in this first week in May 1915, more than 360 people bathed during that week, including 30 ladies on a Thursday afternoon. And also all the people of Hereford enjoyed the sight of 50 young soldiers out of khaki from the barracks, stripping off and jumping into the River Wye for their early morning swim. And so it was the popular place to go, and it was the place to go and swim. In Bill's publication, In Our Age, he includes an interview with Alf Evans from 1916. Not that he did the interview then, but the interview was a memory of 1916 of Alf, who lived with his grandparents down at the Wyeside Inn off the Home Lacey Road. And he used to walk up the river to go and swim at the Bartonsham. And the old boatman would come across in his punt and pick up Alf and take him over to change and swim in the annex, and much to the envy and jealousy of his friends. But as Alf pointed out, it was really because he always had, coming up from the Wyeside Inn, a bottle of beer in his knapsack, which helped encourage the boatman to come across and pick him up. In fact, Alf also explained that most of the young people learned how to swim by going out along the plank, along the diving board, and then with a rope around their shoulders, the attendant would help pull them along in the current, and they'd soon learn to swim that way. The changing facilities at the Bartonsham were part of a sort of prudishness that had come upon the English people, and a reluctance to have public nakedness, because people hot after work were quite used to stripping off and just jumping into the river. And so by providing changing facilities, people had somewhere and wanted to change. Next slide, please, Chloe. And you can see here a large number of gentlemen, probably from the town council, showing off the opening of the Bartonsham, although they do look maybe as though they're queuing up to change there for a good swim. And as a result of this concern about public nakedness, the move went from places like the Bartonsham instead to public lidos. Next slide, please, Chloe. And it was possible then to include rules such as what costumes had to be worn and various things like no bombing, no heavy petting, and so on. And by setting all these rules, you could have more control of the unwashed being out for their swim and for their dip. And so at that time, when lidos were built, and then in 1939, when the Edgar Street baths were built, indoor baths in Hereford, which have now become the Courtyard Theatre, people no longer, swimming at the Bartonsham declined, it went out of favour, and gradually the annex was abandoned and went into disrepair. Next slide, please, Chloe. Now, there was a revival of interest in swimming about 20 years ago when Roger Deacon wrote this book called Waterlog about outdoor swimming across the UK, trying out different places to swim, lakes and rivers. And as a result of that, there has been a rekindling, particularly amongst the middle classes, and now it's not called outdoor bathing, it's called wild swimming. And in the European Union, we've been shamed into cleaning up our beaches over the last 40 or 50 years, but the same hasn't really happened with our rivers and our lakes. However, there is one river in this country that has bathing water status, and that's the River Wharfe in Ilkley. And they campaigned last year to get status as a bathing river. And part of that was shaming Yorkshire Water into cleaning up its act in their sewage works that pumped out into the River Wharfe. And E. coli from raw sewage is not really compatible with swimming. But next slide, please, Chloe. If you see, here we are at the bathing station, and you'll be pleased to hear that this swimming in Hereford and most of the wild swimming that takes place in the River Wye now is upstream of the Ine sewage treatment works. Next slide, please, Chloe. And down around the bend of the River Wye and round the Bartonsham Meadows, this is a picture from the 1950s, an aerial photo of the sewage treatment works. Now, you might think that those of us who live in Bartonsham might be a little bit disappointed to have this on our patch, so to speak, because, well, it does take up quite a lot of land, but also, you know, there is a lingering smell that kind of passes across the meadows from time to time. But actually, we're very proud to house this because we know we're taking one really for the Hereford team, because when Hereford passed its prime by about the 17th century, it was pretty poverty stricken, and keeping the wells and the pumps clean in a low-lying place on a floodplain was particularly difficult when people were emptying their piss pots and stinking excrements to the great annoyance of their neighbours. And typhus, diarrhea, smallpox, typhoid were common, and life expectancy in Hereford was very low. Cholera was stalking across the country, but luckily it didn't reach Hereford. However, it turned out to be a sanitary reformer, because Hereford Council in 1853 instructed Thomas Rammell in a 4-day inquiry to have a look at what sanitation was like in Hereford, and he was quite horrified. He saw that cesspools were seeping into well water and drains were discharging into the brooks, and the Castle Mill Pond, next slide please Chloe, was the most glaring evil of all. Now, I don't know if you can see this well enough, but towards the bottom of that picture is the Castle Mill Pond, which was all part of the moat of the old castle at in Hereford that Linda mentioned, that was raised after the Civil War. Now, this apparently was an absolutely stinking place. And as at that time, everybody thought that you got these infectious diseases from a miasma of smells, you can imagine that they thought this was how they probably caught all these diseases. What actually happened probably was their cups of tea, because the best way to make a cup of tea, apparently to make the tea leaves go furthest, was to buy a halfpenny bucket of river water to make your tea. So the council acted quickly, and the following year in 1854, they appointed Timothy Curley, the civil engineer, and you can see his name, Curley's plan is here, to have a look at the recommendations made by Rammell. And he said that he could not believe such scenes of filth and uncleanliness in a civilized community, with the floors of privies inundated by the semi-fluid contents of cesspools, sometimes too filthy to be entered. And so Curley drew up a map for drainage and sewage for the city. And those plans are still on the wall behind the stairs in Hereford Town Council in the town hall. Initially, all his sewers were discharging into the River Wye. And in fact, it wasn't until the 1970s that untreated sewage was routinely, no longer routinely discharged into the River Wye. But then in 1885, work started on the Bartonsham sewage treatment plant. Successfully serving the city for quite some time, as Hereford grew, by the Second World War, it was a city of 50,000, and so a bigger sewage treatment works was needed. Next slide, please, Chloe. And it was built here on the Bartonsham, on top of the old 1885 sewage treatment works. Well, needless to say, within the first week or two of this being built, just after the Second World War, the whole site flooded. Now, this is a flooding picture. It's not very good quality, I'm sorry, but it's from a few years ago after the work in 1940s. But you can see, I mean, and this flooding is nothing compared to what we've had recently or even last year. But you can see that the sewage treatment works, that dark area at the bottom of the loop of the river, is completely protected from the pools of water all around it. And that's because they had to think quickly. They dredged the river and they built a retaining, a large embankment wall all the way around the sewage treatment plant to protect it from flooding in the future. So remember that phrase that I've said to you about discharging of untreated sewage? Well, in 1978, a new pipeline was built to a new sewage treatment plant at Rotherwas, and dry weather sewage is taken across that pipeline to Rotherwas now, and you can just about see it as the river loops around. You can see something that looks like a little bridge crossing over, and that's a pipeline taking the sewage to Rotherwas. But although routinely untreated sewage is not pumped into the Wye now, we don't know for sure that stormwater drains that discharge into the Wye, some at the sewage treatment plant and some at the old Wye Bridge, don't contain sewage in times of flooding and inundations. because this would cause spills, as the Environmental Agency calls it. We don't know at the moment because they're not monitored. But the Ilkley campaign found levels of E. coli 100 times that recommended for human contact in their citizen science project before they campaigned for bathing water status. So perhaps if there's a revival of wild swimming at the Bartonsham and we get the numbers that we had in Edwardian times, it might be possible to consider monitoring that for the future and thinking about clean bathing water in the River Wye. And maybe the journey of the swimmer and the sewage plant will open a new chapter. Handing on now to Andy.
Good evening. Next slide, please. Gone the wrong way. That's it. Now I'm going to talk about the watermills on the Bartonsham Bend. Now this photograph is a LiDAR photograph, so it emphasizes the contours of the ground. And in the middle of the meadows, you can see old ploughing lines from earlier years, in fact, earlier centuries. I'm going to start talking on the top left-hand side about the Hereford Weir. Now, this was a substantial weir, 5 foot high and about 125 meters long. It's a diagonal weir. The reason for that is it helps it when it floods not to damage it so much because the water level doesn't get too high. Now it had 3 purposes and possibly 4. The possible fourth was it raised the water 5 foot and enabled it to increase the water level on the moat in front of the castle during the medieval time. This is a very early medieval weir. It was also a fish weir. There are many fish weirs in medieval times down the Wye. The third thing, it had a flash lock in it to enable boats to go up and down in the 1600s. And the fourth, most important, was the leat. This light blue line that, having got the water 5 foot higher, it could flow around effectively a canal all the way around the outside of the bend, round to where the square red dot is, which is where the Hereford Mills were. Now, this was a complex of mills which had 5 water mills there, and very important in medieval period for both flour grinding and for fulling cloth, woolen cloth. Now, the mills don't exist any longer because they've been washed away because the bend continually erodes to the southeast direction. And you'll see the green lines, the old river bends, and you can see these smiles on the map where previous riverbanks occurred. This river is only about 10,000 years old since the last ice age, and it's slowly progressing down. And also the mill leat no longer exists because it's effectively in the river. Could we have next slide, please? Now, on the weir, there would have been a flash lock like this in the 1600s. The idea of a flash lock was a single set of gates, and you can see the weir, the man in charge of the weir standing on the weir, having removed some floodboards and also the reamers that hold the floodboards in place to make a gap so a barge can come downstream. And here you see one coming down with barrels of cider and bales of wool. And to get a boat back upstream, you'd actually wait till the level drops quite considerably, and then you'd haul it up on a rope on a big winch. Next slide, please. Now, we now go down to the mills. Now, this is what the mills would be looked like in Tudor times, and there were 5 of them, and they were rebuilt at this time because Henry VIII had them knocked down in 1535 during the Reformation, because he fell out with the Dean and Chapter about religion and Catholicism. It's a long story and we won't go into it now. Anyway, 20 years later, they were rebuilt, and in this sort of format. This is not one of the mills because there are no pictures of them or drawings of them. So they'd have small overshot wheels with a stone base and timber frame, and probably thatch roofs rather than shingles, as you see in this. and there were 2 corn mills and 3 fulling mills. Now I want to talk about the fulling mills because they're a bit more interesting. Next slide, please. Now, fulling is a process where when the cloth is actually having been spun and woven, you get a long length of cloth, and it needs to be tightened by a felting process. And before fulling mills came along, walkers used to stand in tubs like this and tread the cloth, and the tubs were full of cold water and fuller's earth and a dash of pig's urine just to improve the flavor. And it was a horrible job. So any relation of yours who's got a surname Walker, you know what they did in medieval times. Next slide, please. So this was quickly mechanized and replaced by fulling, where you've got basically 2 what are called stocks, effectively mallets, that actually knead the cloth. And here you see a fuller feeding the cloth into the fulling box, and the fulling box was full of fuller's earth and water, and of course the pig's urine. And this enabled the cloth to be turned and kneaded for about an hour and a half, and then the cloth was withdrawn from the box. Next slide, please. And it was laid out on a rack called a tentering rack. Can we have the next slide, please? Yes, and here we have a tentering rack. These were as long as the cloth was, and the width of the cloth, and it had tentering hooks on each side to be able to pull it tight to the right length. Now, the important thing at this stage, apart from drying the cloth out and stretching it and getting it straight again, it was actually inspected at this time, and there was always a place set by the fulling mill, either called rack walk or rack close or rack lane. And in this case, in the documents, there was a rack close, and it was inspected by the guild to ensure that any cloth mill put through this fulling mill was up to standard and it was woven properly and there was no damage from the fulling mill. All right, now we'll move on to the next slide. And we'll see where this rack close was. If you look on the bend on the southeastern side, you'll see a green finger pointing out, going out and back. Now, this is the boundary of St Owen's parish, which, as you see, is the parish that Bartonsham Meadows is in. And this is a rather bit of an anomaly because it's on the other side of the river, which is another parish. And this is probably where Rack Close was laid out. And the reason for it was that it extended the liberties of Hereford City into the next door parish in Lower Bullingham, to ensure that the Guild of Fullers and the Guild of Weavers could ensure that their cloth was to Hereford City standards. And it was important to keep the quality at a certain standard. All right. And you see a house building marked on this rack. That is the only remaining building that existed by 1802. The actual mill stopped working in 1700 when the Wye navigation took down the weir, as it did with all the other weirs down the Wye, so that you could get boats on barges all the way up to the city. Now, if anybody's got a photograph or knows anybody who lived in that house, it eventually was demolished in the 60s, but it was lived in until the 30s, and it's mentioned in the census records. Or a photograph, I'd love to see it, because it's the last remaining remnant of the Hereford mills. The actual mills in this picture would be actually in the river. Now, if we could move on to the next slide, which is another mill, the bone mill. Now, this is the location. This is in Outfall Road, and there is a building there called the Bone Mill still, but it's actually a motor repair shop. And now a bone mill was effectively crushed animal bones for bone meal and other things. And it looked like a cider mill, but it had 2 edge runner stones, slightly smaller chase, that's the bottom platform. And effectively, it was also a knacker's yard, and it continued to be a knacker's yard till the 1930s. Now, with that, I suspect any waste of that was chucked in the river, and doubtless the fish either enjoyed it or hated it. We'll find out from Marcia. I'll pass her over to you now.
Thanks, Andy. Hi everyone. So this is a lovely 18th century view of the River Wye at Bartonsham. You can see the cathedral in the background there, and a trading barge is making its way downstream. But in the foreground we have a gentleman fishing, most likely for salmon. And the Wye is world famous for its salmon. It was a very expensive sport, and it attracted a very particular audience, a steady stream of kings, princes, emperors, politicians, captains of industry, all with very deep pockets, tempted by the promise of one of these. Next slide, please, Chloe. The salmon. They were big, very big. The heaviest ever caught in the Wye was around 59 pounds, and there were plenty of them. I interviewed an old fisherman, 88, Maurice Hudson. He's described by many as the old man of the river. And he remembers a time, the Wye in his youth, when he described it as being rippling with salmon. There were so many of them. He said you could almost walk across the river. There were so many of them. But today it's a very different picture. Numbers have reduced dramatically. As a salmon river, the Wye is a pale imitation of its former self. Where once upon a time anglers would talk about how much their last salmon weighed, today it's more likely to be how many months or even years since they last took a bite. Hereford Anglers Club fished the waters at Bartonsham, and their official weigh-in was at the Brewers Arms. Next slide, please, Chloe. And here we are, the Brewers Arms, with a very smart bunch of gentlemen standing there. One of the club's regular members was a gentleman called Jack Catchpole, wonderful name. He was also a fantastic storyteller, Jack, and he described to me the fishing heyday of the 1960s. He said, you used to have your fish weighed in at the Brewers Arms, and you then sold them. It was an easy way to make money. He goes on, in the early days, you could go over the railway bridge to fish with permission from the railway people, as long as you recognised the time of the train. Down on the river at Ine was where all the people who were on the dole used to go and earn beer money. I used to go when the sun went down, and you could see all these little red dots where all the men were smoking. It was an easy way to make money. But of course, the Wye wasn't just about salmon fishing. It also had good pike fishing. Next slide, please, Chloe. And this, to the uninitiated, and I include myself in that until a few years ago, this is a pike. And like salmon, money could be made from freshly caught pike if you are prepared to take the initiative. In the 1980s, one 10-year-old was playing by the river near the Victoria Bridge and found a dead pike washed up. Immediately, the boy spotted its commercial potential. He said, I picked it up and balanced it on the handlebars of my bike, and then made my way to the public toilets on Castle Green. In there, I found an old cup and used that to rinse and clean the pike and generally freshen it up. After that, I took it to Fishy Gardeners, the fishmonger on King Street, and sold it to him for a handsome sum. Fishy was also open to buying eels. Next slide, please, Chloe. Again, these are a pair of eels. Their decline in numbers, up to 97%, according to some sources, is even more devastating than that of the salmon. Yet, they are the untold story of the Wye. Next slide, please, Chloe. While salmon fishing was for the moneyed classes, eels have provided a free and plentiful food source for centuries for those lower down the supposed social rankings. Another old fisherman I interviewed was Gary MacLeod. He's now in his late 70s, but as a child, he remembers sinks full of writhing eels in the sculleries at the back of terraced houses in Bartonsham. He said, we used to come out to the pub at night, get 2 flagons of GL cider, and we'd be there down at the river all night eeling. offals good bait. And you'd come back in the morning and come away with a whole bag of eels. You'd bring them home and Mum would skin them. She'd nail the eel to the pantry door, incise carefully around the neck, and then just pull the skin off like you would a sock off your leg. Then cut them up, put them in the oven. Delicious. Bit like cod. And even further back, right back to the 14th century, canons at Hereford Cathedral were making a decent income from eel traps at Hereford Weir. Next slide, please, Chloe. Andy mentioned the weir just now. And this is just an interpretation. This is taken from another river, but it would have looked like this. See these conical cane baskets, traps. They were a common sight up and down the river. Like salmon, the river was rippling with the sheer numbers of eel. There were so many of them, and an inexhaustible supply. A fascinating document of 14th century mid-accounts gives some insight into the lucrative and reliable income from these eel traps. And I quote directly from the accounts. 5 shillings and 4 pennies from half a stick of large eels. A stick was equivalent to 25 eels. Canon Walter Romsbury, for eels sold to himself, 10 shillings. 3 shillings and 5 pennies from 25 eels sold this year. Nothing for large eels this year. And finally, 5 shillings and 8 pennies for the sale of 1 salmon and 2 shillings and 8 pennies for the sale of 8 sticks of eels. And that's it. Thank you. And over to Ian.
Hello. For the next few minutes, I'll be offering a brief and simplified canter through the ridiculously complex arrival of the railways in Hereford and how it might have, and eventually did, affect Bartonsham. Until the 19th century, the only means of supplying Hereford with bulky items such as coal was by way of the River Wye. This was slow, labour-intensive, and due to fluctuating water levels, very unpredictable. A canal was planned from Gloucester, and it opened to Ledbury in 1798, but only finally reaching Hereford in 1845, just as steam-hauled railways were being developed. Hereford's first railway arrived in 1829, a horse-drawn tramway running from the canal wharf at Abergavenny to a terminus on the banks of the River Wye, where the southern end of the Greyfriars Bridge now stands. This is Bartonsham in the early 1840s, when there's very little in the way of housing, apart from a ribbon of occupation along St Owen Street and Iron Road. The area is still agricultural, with orchards, market gardens, arable and pasture, a sparsely populated suburb with very few residents. Park Street can be seen as the boundary between the fields called Middle Piece and Lower Piece, and to the south of them, Road Ditch and Iron Meadow. In the mid-19th century, railway mania was spreading across the land, and although regulated by Parliament, it was pretty much a free-for-all with no overall plan or guiding hand to coordinate matters. This resulted in much competition and duplicate plans often being put forward to cover the same route. In 1836, 2 routes from Gloucester were proposed, one by the celebrated engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who surveyed a line to Hereford via Ross. However, due to an economic downturn, plans were not progressed until the mid-1840s, by which time other plans were being suggested to cover the same basic route. 2 of these proposals would have crossed the river by where the sewage works now lie, crossed the meadows at right angles to the future Park Street to terminate at a station situated in the area of St Owen's Gate. A third scheme, soon abandoned, would have taken the line south of the river, avoiding Bartonsham completely and linking with the former tramway from Abergavenny, which is already planning to convert to a proper railway. Other ideas affecting Bartonsham that came to naught included a grandiose scheme for a line to run from Swansea across to Yarmouth in Norfolk, passing Hereford on an alignment between where Park Street and Harold Street now stand. Further variations were contemplated as companies came and went and the various competitors vied for advantage over one another. Two main lines reached Hereford ahead of the Gloucester scheme. The Newport, Abergavenny and Hereford, the former tramway, arriving at a station at Barton in the west of the city, now where Sainsbury's is, and the Shrewsbury and Hereford with its terminus at Bars Court to the north of the city. Both of the lines opened on the 6th of December 1853, and it's quickly recognised that some sensible accommodation had to be reached to facilitate through traffic from the north to Gloucester in the south. The proposed St Owen's Gate terminus was then abandoned, and a deviation into Bars Court was agreed along the line that survives today as far as Rotherwas, and the meadows were therefore saved. The Gloucester-Hereford line opened on the 1st of June 1855, sadly closing in 1964 under Dr. Beeching's rationalisation plans. This image of the Iron Railway Bridge was made in 1866 and is still recognisable today. So the basic layout of the North-South Railway network was almost complete, almost but not quite. The Newport and Abergavenny line, which ran into its terminus at Barton, was finding the station cramped and inconvenient, and by the 1860s was looking for a solution to aid capacity and connectivity with other lines. Thus, a deviation was planned to link the Abergavenny line with the Hereford-Gloucester. The first suggested route would once again put Bartonsham Meadows under threat. Leaving the existing Abergavenny route at Red Hill, the extension would cross the river near Putson Manor, cutting diagonally through the meadows, and join the Gloucester line by the bridge over Ledbury Road at Foley Street. Happily for us, and for reasons unknown, although the ownership of the meadows may have been a factor, it was finally agreed to run the line further south, and in 1866 the Red Hill or Rotherwas curve was opened on the alignment it still occupies today. How Bartonsham might have developed had any of these alternative schemes come to fruition is open to speculation, but it's safe to say that the layout of the Victorian suburbs, which developed following the arrival of the railways, would have looked entirely different, and the meadows would have been irrevocably changed. It just leaves me to point out that for this piece, the majority of the information and most of the images have been shamelessly lifted from Gordon Wood's wonderfully detailed book, The Railways of Hereford, which is still, although not in print, it's still readily available and worthy of further investigation. Thank you for listening. Over to you, Ruth.
Hello, thanks ever so much, Ian. I'm Ruth Westerby and I'm part of Friends of Bartonsham Meadows. So it's a little bit of a change of gear here because I'm going to be talking about a project, a campaign that we've set up about a year ago now. So it's less about how the river works and was managed, and more about Bartonsham Meadows themselves and a vision for the future, really, and how we could bring these, manage these meadows restore them to floodplain meadow management, which would make them work for the community and the environment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why we set ourselves up, how we got set up, what our vision is for going forward, and then just give you a project update on what we've done so far. So our vision is to transform this small suburban riverside farm from intensive agriculture to outstanding natural habitat, delivering a broad range of social and environmental public goods. So our focus has been on biodiversity and regenerative land management practices, and this can deliver loads of stuff that would be fantastic, not just for the locality, but for the region and for global climate change mitigation. So flood mitigation is one of the biggest things. If we can store the water on the land for longer, then we'll stop flash flooding further downstream. And of course, we've seen much more frequent and devastating floods in the last few years, and the last weekend has shown that as well. And in fact, we set up, it was exactly a year ago that we got going in just such a situation as this, because what had happened this time last year was that the land was sprayed, it flooded, washed everything into the river. Then they ploughed the land to plant a crop, and again, the land flooded and all the topsoil went off into the river. And we can see that pattern repeating now. But so other things that managing this land in a more sustainable way would deliver would be carbon sequestration, biodiversity, improved river water quality, leisure and quality of life. This is in a unique location, being surrounded by the city. So it would contribute to the lives of locals in a phenomenal way, I think, and could contribute to sustainable agriculture and food production. So could you flick me through? Thank you. So this slide tells you a little bit about how a floodplain meadow could be managed. And I've taken this from a report that Anna Gundry wrote up. Anna is on our working group and she's a local ecologist, and she's written a fantastic, much longer piece that's on our website. So please do check out our website if you'd like a little bit more detail on this. Historically, how meadows like this would have been managed, they would have been allowed to flood. They would have then grown a species-rich hay crop up until the beginning of August, a sort of Lammas time. Then the hay would have been cut and you'd have had a cattle to graze the land and to reduce kind of shrubs and things back down, and then the animals wouldn't overwinter on the land. So we'd like something like that back for this, this site. Next slide, please, Chloe. Thank you. So we were set up in February 2020, and it seemed at that point that there were a number of factors that made this a real possibility for change. The land is owned by the church commissioners and had been managed for 3 generations by the Matthews family as a dairy farm. And in fact, it was only very recently that it was put to arable as a consequence of the pressures on farming. So we saw the situation was ripe for initiating a dialogue with the church commissioners that we have been doing over this last year. And in fact, we're speaking with them again tomorrow. So a couple of weeks ago, they mentioned they have concluded the sale of the farmhouse, the farm buildings, and the higher land around the paddock area. And over this last year, we have also been developing networks and partnerships, particularly with Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, who would be very enthusiastic to manage this land as a floodplain meadow. And of course, Herefordshire Wildlife Trust manage 55 sites in the county, so they are extraordinarily well experienced and positioned to undertake this sort of development. And as many of you will know, they manage the lug meadows on the other side of Hereford, as well as meadows like the Sturts. Okay, you can jump to the next slide, please, Chloe. So the sorts of things that we've been doing is we set up a working group, we worked on a mission statement, we've developed frequently asked questions. You can see all of these on our website. We've been reaching out to individuals to support us. We've done various activities with the members who've joined. We cleaned up the road ditch, we did a walk of the site. And the supporting organisations who we are really grateful for embracing this vision and supporting us include, of course, the Herefordshire Wildlife Trust and the City branch, Bartonsham History Group, who are hosting this fascinating event this evening, have been supportive from the outset and in fact prodded me into action. St James and Bartonsham Community Association, they're the local organisation who have kind of brought us in under their wing to help us collect funds, for example, because we are not yet constituted until well, probably until the meeting that we have tomorrow. It's still a little unclear what our constitution needs to be in terms of whether we will be able to manage the land alongside Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, or whether we're more of a sort of harrying organisation who are holding whoever is managing the land to account. So we're very grateful to people who have made donations to us, and so far we've spent that money on a poster campaign, well, a leaflet campaign, and we pay Chloe, our assistant, who is doing an amazing communications campaign for us. So we've been in touch with many stakeholders, including, of course, Herefordshire Council, our local MP. We made a bid for the Stronger Towns Fund, because although we didn't yet have management control of the land, we thought that accessing that pot of money would enable us to do what we had in mind. And unfortunately, we didn't get that funding, but that was one of the big things that we did towards the end of last year. Chloe, could you pop me over to the next one, please? Thank you. So some of you may have signed up for our newsletters, which we try to send out once a month. And we've also got social media accounts, Facebook and Instagram, so you can have a look at what we're doing there. BBC Hereford and Worcester interviewed us for radio, so that a few of us spoke there. Charlie as well, who's in the audience tonight, if he wants to speak a bit later. So thank you to BBC Hereford and Worcester for setting out how this could become a haven for wildlife and work for the people of Herefordshire. We also did an online event with Herefordshire Wildlife Trust, which you can watch back from our website. Could you jump across to the next one, please, Chloe? Okay, so I think that's all from me. I was trying to be quite quick there. And if you have any questions, I think Bill's going to host a bit of a Q&A. So please, could I hand over to Bill? Bill, you're muted. Bill, you're still muted.
Again. Well, you can probably hear me better than you could hear Ian just now, which is a bit of a shame. Thank you, everybody. That's fantastic. It isn't easy. This Zooming is not as easy as it looks. I do want to thank you, Linda, Fran, Marsha, Andy, Ian, for your contributions. We normally would have done this wandering around the field in a light-hearted state. Okay, so over to yourselves. I don't know if anybody's actually got any questions, and if you have, thank you. Oh, where did that just go? Where's my chat gone? Thank you, Bill, Andy. Please ask the host to give you permission to record. Close. Sorry, I don't know what that means. Thank you, Bill. And okay, that's very kind. Thank you, Jeremy. That's our local councillor who's also been extraordinarily supportive. Anybody want to ask anything? Because you haven't gone up on the chat. If you haven't, just stick a hand up. Is that a Sarah hand going up? No, that's it. Can I go and have my beer now? Oh, no.
Oh, I wanted to ask something. Hello.
Yes, hello. Say who you are and ask away.
My name's Bella Hesbrook. I'm just interested, are we talking about creating traditional water meadows? The historical water meadows that were around the city centuries ago. Is this the aim?
Thanks, Bella. I'll pass you on to Ruth.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bella. And I might have to pass you on to somebody else because I'm not the environmentalist in our group. And luckily we have many better qualified people than myself to advise on things like this. So one of the questions would be, how could you manage the land to retain floodwater? And that would take really careful planning. If you had a series of ponds and orchards, then it would help to retain the water on the land for longer. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure of the technical details.
No.
Who else wants to jump in? I wonder if Jeremy can help or Charlie can help on that.
I could try if that. Really, we need actually Dave Lovelace, who's not on the call, because Dave has done a huge amount of research on flood meadows and how they operate in Hereford.
Yes, because you can still see the remains on the other side of Aylstone Hill. I think there were like channels, ditches that were dug all over the fields.
Yes, the best known examples of flood meadows are those at Turnston, which the Countryside Restoration Trust acquired near Church about 10, 12 years ago. And they were, as Ruth mentioned, works that were built specifically to give a flush to the pastures early in the spring, so that particularly if you've got a dry spring, you get your grass growing quicker than you would otherwise.
That's right.
Obviously, this land floods, but it floods involuntarily. The slight difference between a controlled flood and meadow and what we've got at Bartonsham is that at Bartonsham we can't say when it's going to flood, and it's rather difficult to manage.
Yes, I'm not sure how they work, but it was all about fertility of the ground, of the land. Yes.
They work by very carefully dug leats with lots of sluices and channels. And that is the case at Turnston.
The one at Turnston,
Richard wants to say something.
Yeah, the the ones at Turnstone were built by someone Vaughan back in the 15th century, and they had a but the purpose of that was quite different. It was really to increase grazing early in the year, and they used the water often to get the frost out of the ground. But it was a different climate then. It had a lot much colder winters, and getting the frost out and inundating the ground would help it get growing more quickly. But I don't envisage that that will be the chief objective of the current proposals. I would imagine that holding water in and increasing biodiversity would be now more urgent priorities, rather than increasing the bulk of grass growing in the early spring. So I think it wouldn't be that traditional system, but have similarities as well.
Thank you.
We've had a couple of questions on the chat. Jack asks about exactly where, perhaps Fran, you might be able to step up for this one, exactly where the Bartonsham swimming station was. Is it where those 4 poplar trees are today?
I referred him to you, Bill, actually, because you show us where it is when we take the walk around the meadows. I said it's further south than that. It's where the bank dips in to the meadows, isn't it? As far as I can tell.
Yeah, absolutely. We have plans to mark the spot by having a ceremonial swim there to test out how clean the water is in what, Fran? March?
Well, May the 15th. Well, May, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay. Somebody's going to be there. Yes, Richard.
Yes, I just wanted to say, are Ruth and the Bartonsham team in touch with Nicola Cutcher, who's doing the Friends of the Upper Wye, because they're doing some great work and they're trying to get citizen science projects going to monitor the water quality along the Wye, and they're linked in. They had a very good Zoom conference with people from the Rivers Network hosted by Stroud Green Party, but they had speakers from the Ilkley group who had cleaned up their river, and various other rivers around Britain where people were trying to improve water quality. It was an extraordinarily good Zoom session, but I think I was probably the only person from Hereford involved in it. But I'll put you in touch with Nicola Cutcher. She's also making a video, documentary with George Monbiot for television about water quality, and they're focusing on the Wye. So you really ought to be involved in that. I'll put you in touch by email.
Great, thanks ever so much. I think Fran, did you go to that meeting?
It might not have been the same one. I went to the Ilkley Clean Water campaign. The slight difference for them is that that sewage is a big issue for them, particularly because of the discharge into the River Wharfe, and because swimmers were actually getting sick, and also because of the volume of swimmers they had, because they have about 1,000 swimmers on hot days. And I think our problems are with the ecology of the Wye, aren't they? And the phosphates and nitrates and so on that are discharged into the Wye. To rebuild the ecosystem, we need to sort of deal with the runoff from different fields and so on, rather than the sewage treatment plants as such at the moment.
I think we have both.
Yeah.
But yes, the Ilkley team were involved in the Stroud conversation. They were contributing to it, but it was, yeah, they do a lot of things, I think, online.
There has been a question, Ruth, maybe you might be able to answer this. Paddy asks, do we know what's happened to the farm buildings and who they're sold to?
The Church Commissioners, when we met with them 2 weeks ago, didn't tell us who they had sold them to. So I believe it'll be either Cotswold Dairy, who have been managing it on behalf of Bartonsham Meadows, or it could be the Matthews family, but we'll speak with them tomorrow and I'll ask them. Well, if we can, we'll put a message out.
Okay, several of you very kindly offered to make a donation or a contribution to this meeting. We decided no, blooming heck, we're a bunch of amateurs. We'll keep it as a freebie. but do look out for, if you're local particularly, or if you're from Saskatchewan, do join the Friends of Bartonsham Meadows and register with bartonshamhistory.org.uk, which is just an opportunity for me to mention some of the people in the Bartonsham History Group who weren't speaking tonight, in particular Christine Earle, who is responsible for our fantastic website, and which is incredibly accessible. Do clock into that. And Ruth how do you do that, Ruth? That's so neat. Ruth has just posted the Friends of Bartonsham Meadows on the chat, and she could probably do the Bartonsham History Group. She can indeed. Wonders of modern technology. Can I just ask, Charlie has been very involved as an archaeologist. Is this true? Anyway, Charlie, can you say a little bit about the archaeology of the meadows? You got 30 seconds. No, you got half a minute.
Wow. Yeah. Well, that's quite easy because we know bugger all about it, really. There's a lot of lumps and bumps and ditches and banks, and there's various theories. We obviously know the road ditches there. We know now, thanks to Ian's excavations, that's probably does have at least some activity in associated to the Civil War. But we also know that its origins are probably as a kind of a drainage, a natural feature, an Iron Age paleo channel. So probably one of the former sort of branches of the Wye before the Wye took its current course. But otherwise, there's lots of ideas. There's about all these banks and ditches across the fields. Probably a lot of them are ridden furrows, sort of remains of ancient plough marks, and some of them are there's thought to be a trackway, an ancient sunken trackway, which was basically the kind of continuation of the Green Street line, coming straight. If you just follow it straight down that footpath, once you get down into the second field, there's kind of like embankments on both sides, and it looks like that was an ancient trackway. But other than that, yeah, it's all sort of open to interpretation. There's some theories that there was one of these water meadows. Some of these banks and ditches were all about channeling water from the Wye into the field, but we have no evidence for that, really. That's more of a sort of an interpretation, an idea, theory, I think, of David Whitehead's. It's a nice one, and it makes sense in some ways. But otherwise, yeah, you know, when the fields are ploughed, you do find the odd bit of medieval pottery, but it's likely these fields were generally agricultural right from the Saxon period right through to now. So it's unlikely we'd find lots of material culture in those soils. But it's exciting, yeah. I mean, if we do get a chance to manage the fields, there's a chance we could launch some more community excavations and try and figure out what these lumps and bumps are, and yeah, try and get a bit more understanding.
Thanks, Charlie. That's really kind of, and if you're having a look at the chatty thing, you can see that Jeremy Milne, our councillor, is suggesting that we organise a dig on the site of the mill building, which Andy says was still standing in the 1960s. So there we are. We've got another little project on the go. I think that we're probably, I haven't had a beer for almost a day and a half now. I'm really ready for mine now. Oh, just one question. Any pollen cores taken? Anybody answer that one? No?
I mean, I'm not on the meadows, no, but it'd be a good idea. Definitely. I think there's this Ice Age pond group started in Herefordshire, isn't there, which is quite exciting. And I think there's quite a lot of links there with the kind of the findings of the community excavation of the road ditch. We now know that was a paleo channel, an ancient water course, you know, probably early Holocene, so 10,000 years old. And it's likely that some of those old bends of the river that I think Andy pointed to, and there's some kind of natural wetlands that form there after the floods that we've all seen, and the birds love to congregate on those. And I think some of those are probably ancient ponds and paleo channel. So it would be worth getting some cores done there and actually potentially trying to reconstruct what the indigenous vegetation of that floodplain was, going back into the through the Holocene, so through the last sort of 10,000 years. There's a lot of potential there, I think.
Joe is pointing. Thanks, Jacqueline. Joe's pointing out that there's a talk on the Ice Age ponds at the Coffee Pot in 2 weeks' time. And unless anybody's got any more pressing questions, I think for the history group, of course, we'll have a catch up later, I think is the answer to that, Ian. I think it just only remains to say a big thank you to Chloe, wherever Chloe is, and to Ruth for the Zoomie, but thanks especially to Chloe and our speakers. And that's it. Thank you very much. Bye.